hoping to learn from this talk, go ahead and drop it in the chat. And you are also going to, oh, let's see. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that some folks are having trouble with the stream. Sometimes that happens. And there's also a little question box down in the near the chat. If you have a question, please go ahead and drop it there, and I'll do my best to kind of keep an eye on things. And yeah, we'll just kind of see what we get through. I will also include at the end a link to a PDF with the slides. So, oh, hello, Montana. I'm going to be up there in just about a week. I'm going to Glacier soon. So nice to see you all. Okay, let's keep going. So what we are going to, come on, there we go. Come on, slides are tricky. What we're going to cover today, I'm going to talk a little bit about some generally agreed upon haunting types. I'm going to give some suggestions about how and why to start with diplomacy if you are existing in a little bit of a haunted space. I am going to offer some high-level tips for spiritual hygiene and some remedies for haunted spaces, and then some suggestions for finding support when a heavier hand is called for. Let's see. A little bit of my background for context. So I already kind of shared that I used to have kind of a more traditional role in the working world. But, at the end of the day, I'm a heels on the ground spiritual worker, and I'm always striving to learn and grow my capacity to be of service. I started, with reading tarot, like many of us do, and realizing through my tarot practice that I was sensitive to the presence of spirits. I was blessed to have a child, a son, when I was 35. And there was something about that experience that kind of cracked open my spiritual gifts. I kind of feel like everything kind of cracked open like a melon dropped on some pavement. And that led me through a whole host of journeys where I've done, kind of classic mediumship development, study and practice. I've been, since I was a little kid, I'd go to haunted spaces with my family. And so I've kind of walked in some of those more paranormal explorer type worlds. That can be a little bit of a strange place to navigate for people who are mediums, because sometimes there's just some built-in suspicion of people with mediumship gifts in those spaces. And yet I've also learned a lot from those experiences. But where I really kind of found my niche was discovering the folk magic tradition of trolldom. It's a type of magical practice found in Scandinavia. And so, okay, so melon dropped. Okay, Runa. Oh, hi, Runa. It's nice to see you. Yeah, melon dropped on the pavement. You know how sometimes that can feel. So a lot of my working with spirits and learning to talk with spirits comes from my study and practice of folk magic. And so that's a little bit different than sometimes what you see in a lot of kind of more spiritualist psychic medium spaces. And a lot of what I do, this is my full-time job, got bills to pay, there's money is unfortunately a part of what I have to do. And a lot of the pro bono work that I often do is related around supporting people who are going through grief. And so using mediumship and, my background I spent 20 years as an advocate for victims and survivors of crime. So I'm able to kind of blend some of those things in the service that I offer to others. But I get a lot of requests for help with haunted spaces and also helping with things like spiritual attachments. And so that's really, I love, it's something I'm really passionate about, because one of the things that I believe is that a haunted space isn't necessarily a bad space. Now, and that kind of goes against the grain of what some other folks believe, but it's been my experience, and in my studies, I have found that across history, spirits have been a part of our magic, our folklore, and our lives. And I really, really do believe that peaceful coexistence is possible. I am going to take a hot minute to just, okay, places can be haunted by helpful spirits. We're going to talk about that in a moment. And all right, so I am going to be, I'm going to say for folks who have questions, go ahead and drop them in that ask a question. Oh, never mind. It looks like the Q&A is disabled. So I'm not going to, I'll do my best to kind of keep up with the chat. And I'll try to look through that at the very end of our time together. Y'all are a chatty group, and I love that. It's tricky. Time is always the factor. But one of the things I want to just really like preface everything with is that, sometimes in kind of these types of spaces, we'll sometimes encounter people who do what I do or do something kind of adjacent to that, who claim that they kind of know. This is exactly what happens. This is exactly how you handle this, all haunted spaces. This is just the way that it is. I would offer that we are working in the realm of both tradition, right? The ways that things have been done, the things that we can learn from history, but we're also working in the realm of best guesses. And I would just say, I don't think anyone has the answers, air quotes, and we should be really cautious of anyone who claims to have the exclusive inside scoop. I was listening to a podcast. It's called Haunted Road with Amy Bruni. I think it was the season finale from last season, and she had on a paranormal author named Richard Estep, and he used the example that that when we're kind of working with the paranormal or like trying to understand, talk with spirits, especially when we're going into trying to understand a haunted space, that it is very much like a Yahoo chat room in the 90s. Over time, we can kind of get a sense of who we're talking to. And at the same time, there's always a lot of unknowns, right? Okay, come on. So very briefly, I'm gonna read through this. What is a spirit? So I will say this is something I cover in depth in my book, Talking to Spirits. But one of the things, we often come to thinking about haunted spaces, thinking about ghosts, which is basically the spirits of something that was once alive. And that's its own rabbit hole, right? Because yes, we usually think of spirits of the human dead, but anything technically that lived and died could have a spirit and become a ghost. That's everything, and that kind of jumps down to the principles behind animism, which is a fundamental belief that everything has a spirit, right? So spirits could include ghosts, thought forms, which are the spirits that we can conjure through intentional actions and also our own beliefs, cryptids, our own spiritual guides, the fae and elemental spirits, cryptids, ETs, demons, gods, angels. And then there's also kind of like blending and braiding theories like reincarnation and time slips. So I just want to like preface that is, even though we're not going to get deeply in the weeds with it, the reason that we want to talk about it is the reason it matters is that, one, it's fun to consider, because I really hope that if you are enjoying spirit communication, you are, one, learning how to be safe, because that is important, but also that you're having fun, because we don't know. It's exploration. It's so interesting to think about this stuff. And also, when you are working with a haunted space, it can guide your approach and possible remedies, right? So this is where my gifts, I had some cute little gifts in here, y'all, but unfortunately, they just didn't come through. There should be little ghosts coming out of those pumpkins right there. So what kind of a haunt do we have here? That's one of the things that sometimes we've got to figure out first when we are dealing with a haunted space. So I am guessing that if you are here, there's quite a few of you that have either lived or worked or been in haunted spaces. And so some of you may be very familiar with some of these classic signs of a haunt. Physical disturbances, literally doors opening and closing. We've got electrical problems, lights flickering, cold spots, maybe some hot spots, broken pipes, noises, disembodied voices, footsteps, things like that. Mental disturbances. Now, these are sometimes going to be the things where there are, I've certainly lived in places, and especially back before I was doing this type of work and didn't really my gifts were very dialed down. It was before the birth of my child. And, I've lived in some places where they can be very, it weighs on you. It can kind of suck your energy. Maybe you find your mood changing. You're having dreams that I lived in a place, I write about this in the book, where I lived in this really awful townhouse. My husband and I had just moved to Denver, Colorado. I am based in the Denver area still. But my husband, he was then my boyfriend. We were living in this little condo in Denver, and it did not look like the type of place that should be haunted, and it was terrifying. Like I don't know if there's anything that could have fixed how nasty that place was. And one of the hardest parts was the dreams. There were just these horrible dreams about violence, waking up in the middle of the night, feeling like there was someone in the room that didn't like you, staring at you, and we would see these flashing lights. I tried blacking out all the windows. I did all kinds of things to try to see, like, is there something logical, right? And it would get really, really cold when we would wake up and the lights would be happening. And bless my poor husband, he knows, he's okay with me sharing this publicly. I thought I had it bad. He had it worse because he would also wake up to someone whispering in his ear. That was an example of a nasty haunt. And also visual disturbances. So like the flashing lights, seeing something walking by out of the corner of your eye. Oh yeah, we've got someone here from the Denver area, Cheeseman Park, all the ghosts. Amen. I actually talk a little bit about Cheeseman in my book. So those are some of the classic signs of a haunt. However, some of the, I will say that now here are some kind of the like generally agreed upon haunting types. And I'm going to weave in times when it's not something to necessarily be terrified about. Okay. Now I will say a lot of places have what is called either, I've always thought of it as like an imprint haunt. A lot of people will call them residual hauntings. And that is where it's like energy left over. And so a classic example that gets used with residual hauntings is the way when I'm going to give a cute example and then like a, uncomfortable example. So, or maybe you might think both of them are uncomfortable. I don't know. But when you walk into a room, we'll do the uncomfortable one first. When you walk into a room where two people have just gotten done fighting, like where there's been an argument, or you walk into a room where there's people that just don't freaking like each other, and you come in and you're like, ugh, this is kind of funky and gross. And then, so that's an example of like how a residual haunting can feel. Or let's say you walk into a space where there's two people who are like newly in love. Maybe you kind of walk in and there was just like a cute little couple that was just like, kind of stealing some kisses when nobody was in the room. And you walk in and you're like, something was just going on here. Those are some of the examples, right? Now, I will say that residual hauntings can often be the imprint of a repeated action. And so oftentimes we go to the place of, maybe it was something traumatic that happened. And, so yes, this type of stuff can happen. Residual hauntings can occur in places where maybe there has been, domestic violence or like prolonged trauma. And that can literally kind of seep into the walls. There is something called stone tape theory, where it is that certain types of materials actually can kind of absorb that energy and kind of like help to amplify that looping thing. So like brick and limestone and things like that. However, sometimes residual hauntings can be kind of like benign. So I lived in a house once where when we first moved in, my husband and I would hear whistling all the time. And we thought it was the other person. Or I'm like, God, and we found ourselves whistling a lot when we first moved in. And I mean, I'm more of a singer. I'm more of a sing off key kind of a person rather than a whistler. And it really did sound like when you'd hear it, the sound was almost kind of like an old fart just wandering through the house, just kind of whistling as they're going about their business. And there was a family that had lived in the space prior that had been there for like 40 years. And I really still believe, and it faded over time, right? So sometimes it can be kind of a benign thing. Sometimes it can be an imprint of a powerful event. Oftentimes our minds go to things like a murder, something traumatic, but it could also be like, what if it's the birth of a child? What if it's like, two people falling in love and it was so powerful that it kind of seeps into the space? It can be left by the living as well as the dead, much like I said, if there's a house that has lots of, I wish that I could teach the spirits to clean the house too. If it's like, you're going to be here, like you might as well start like pulling your weight. You ain't paying rent. Sorry, I keep catching little moments from the chat, and that's a cute one. So, much like I mentioned, you walk into a room where people are fighting. There's also sometimes the living can influence the vibe. And there's also theories that the living can manifest types of paranormal type activity. Something to look into if you are not familiar with it is called the Philip experiment. It's fascinating. And I will say this can largely be addressed through rigorous spiritual hygiene of the home, which we're going to talk about. We're going to spend the bulk of our time talking about that. Sometimes it can be hauntings by a sentient spirit, not always spirits of the human dead. So keep in mind, in a lot of traditions, folk traditions, there are household caretakers. I'm thinking in Sweden, we've got the tomte or the nisse, you've got domovoy, or the brownies or the hob. Those are some of the elemental spirits that are kind of thought to be the caretakers of the home. And I will say when they are maybe unhappy, maybe the house is getting a little dirty, things are not being taken care of the way that they should be, you can have a ticked off household spirit. And that is not something, that's kind of like a whole other set of problems. And so to continue to complicate matters, sometimes you also have to figure out, is it the place? Is it a thing within the place? Or is it a person within the place who is actually haunted? So, Venus, I wish I had the time to get into a haunting by an element or egregore because there's a lot of examples. So do unto others. This is another thing that kind of maybe where my philosophy is a little bit different than what you often will see. There is kind of a perspective out there that all spirits should be crossed over. They should all be cleared out. And that if I encounter a spirit in any place, it's my job to kind of come in as the savior. In my tradition, that's not how we operate. We don't, because remember, we don't really know why all these things happen, right? Yes, I think if we are sensitive to spirits and we have the ability to talk with them, I do think we have a responsibility to maybe say, you all right? You need anything? You got to be nice to the living. This is the way that you got to behave, right? I get to have boundaries because you have the right to feel, as the living person, this world is made for the living. The dead have had their time. We have the right to feel safe and to have boundaries. And at the same time, what if there's a spirit that's kind of wrapping up their unfinished business? We have to maybe be willing to consider that spirits are sovereign beings and avoid savior mentality, because that also can create some hosts of problems. Let's see. I think we kind of talked about that a little bit. Now, and I will say, these are supposed to be my cute little gifts here. A lot of folks will also kind of come in with this idea of, I'm going to cast out anything that's here. Or I get a lot of people who will come to me who are like, I got a haunted house and I burned a bunch of sage and I saged my house and I don't know, the spirits are still here. I will tell you, sage is really fantastic for, lifting the energy of a space. Although white sage, I'm hoping we all kind of have the memo that white sage is over harvested and we need to maybe be looking to other herbal type remedies. Smoke clearing is a wonderful, wonderful thing, but let's all maybe start broadening our horizons, because white sage kind of comes with a whole host of problems, including appropriation. So, and also kind of coming in with, maybe this, all spirits are, demonic, or all spirits, you should not be here. And you don't have a conversation first, again, you might be creating more of a host of problems than you started. Now, the very first thing that I learned back in the day, particularly when I started working with my mentor, my mentor is kind of a, salt of the earth Swede. And, the first thing that I learned was that you got to use your words, much like we teach our kids, right? If you are in a home and you've got spiritual shenanigans that are going on, I will say you always have the option of choosing to try to ignore it. Because I will say, this is in the next slide, but if you talk to someone, you have to know that they're likely going to talk back to you. right? But people, so I encounter a lot of people anymore who seem to be more comfortable having less boundaries with like non-living and things that they can't see than they would with like living people. If you had someone who was being a real pain in the ass in your house and not respecting your boundaries, you tell them, knock it off. If you're going to be here, you better act right. You gotta set your boundaries with spirits. I have a lot of tips in the book about how to have a conversation and set ground rules. Learning me but if you don't act right, I'm going to have to figure out a way to get you out of here. And you also have to be really, really clear about spiritual hygiene for the home and self, which we're going to jump to here in a minute. So we just talked about that already. Now, I will say spiritual hygiene for places is much easier in a contained location like a home or office. It's a way to reinforce your verbalized boundaries. And this really does kind of come back in with, oh, I'm sorry that it froze on you. I apologize. I wish there was something I could do about it, but hopefully the replay will be there. So, reinforcing your verbalized boundaries, spiritual hygiene is, there's kind of something to that phrase, cleanliness is next to godliness. And if you have a spiritually active place, you got to keep the space clean, and using in kind of like magical folkloric materials can be really helpful. So things like, floor washes, which are literally almost make like a tea. One of my favorites uses something called blue agnel, or it's just called laundry bluing. It makes this, you drop it in a pot of water. It makes this beautiful, beautiful, oh, thank you for joining the Curiosity Coven. That's so nice, Jennifer. I'll see you over there. So blue agnel makes this beautiful blue water, and it's used in a lot of traditions to cleanse out negativity, to kind of neutralize any like negativity and funk. And you literally dump it in your mop bucket. You want to make sure it's not going to stain anything, but you put some in your mop bucket. You have already done maybe your sweeping. Maybe if you live in a carpeted space, you just have like little jars of this stuff that are set in different places. You can wipe down commonly used surfaces. And floor washes are great because you can also bring in your favorite herbal allies. You basically make a strong tea that's used to, again, like you're dusting, maybe you're kind of like the liquid you use to wipe down certain areas, you use it in your mop bucket, all kinds of stuff like that. Again, I have a whole bunch of like recipes and things that I like in the book. Now, a few of my favorite things for haunted spaces: camphor. Camphor is, you just have to remember that it's very much like bleach. Okay. So like you want to make sure, I'll kind of talk about the way that I think of cleansing. I've been taught to think of cleansing as a 3-step process. I'll end with that. But camphor is great because you can burn it. It's pretty funky, so you want to make sure you have your windows out, but it just like neutralizes things. And spirits of the dead do, especially tricky trickster spirits, do not like camphor. In a lot of old kind of root work traditions, Vicks Vapor Rub. I bet some of y'all are from, I'm sure that some of you all are from Vicks Vapor Rub families where Vicks is used for everything and anything. It's also really good. Put on the bottom of your feet, put on the back of your neck, on your headboard and your footboard. And that is something that will kind of keep the little ghosties away, especially if you use it with other things as well. Floor washes, I've already talked about. Salt is fantastic. Use salt in the corners of your space. Use it in kind of use it in your baths. Use it to put a little barrier, maybe in front of like your front door and your back door. Tobacco is another one, and frankincense is fantastic for like lifting the vibration of a space so much when you burn it that it pushes out anything funky. I will tell you, it also pairs really well with tobacco, which is an offering for benevolent and helpful spirits. And then the frankincense just lifts the vibe. It's a wonderful traditional incense that I learned many years ago. So spiritual hygiene for the self. Just quickly, It can be really exhausting and traumatizing and everything in between. So for you, if you live in a spiritually active space, you have to take care of yourself. You need to take care of your physical health, your mental health, and your spiritual health. I'm talking everything from avoiding drugs and alcohol, making sure you are getting enough sleep, drinking enough water, eating well, keeping yourself physically clean, using maybe kind of some spiritual cleansing for yourself, using things like spiritual baths, head washes. A really good classic one from my tradition is making a tea of fenugreek seed. When you really focus on it, you got to work it. I talk about that in the book of like how to wake up your materials. But fenugreek seed tea, using it in a bath or as a head wash, can remove the influences of others. It's a really good old folk tradition. But using visualizations, and I always think, you want to clear yourself out, kind of clear out, but then you want to fill back up with something positive. Eat something delicious. Listen to music that you love. Maybe burn a really sweet smelling, wonderful incense. Anoint yourself with lovely oils, and then try to do something to protect it. Right? So it's kind of a three, it's not just cleansing, because it's like if you have an empty glass, let's say you clean out your favorite beautiful barware, you cleanse it, you put it back on the shelf, it's going to fill up with dust again, right? But if you fill it up with something lovely and then seal it, nothing funky can get in, no dust can get in. Now I'm just going to show you when a heavier hand is called for. You can reach out to me. You can look to some of the other wonderful authors that are here with Llewellyn. These are vetted people that kind of, they know their stuff, but it's okay to know that sometimes you're out of your depth. And I will say, even for those of us who do this work professionally, we have our elders and mentors. And I have a group of colleagues that I consult with all the time. Just know when you're out of your depth and don't be scared to ask for help. I'm happy to be a resource for you. And if I can't help you, I have people that I can always refer to, but just don't be afraid to ask for help. So, oh, darn it, y'all, we're getting out of time, but I will say, some other home warding options that you can use. You can protect your home with things like barriers of scorched flaxseed, witch bottles, spirit bottles. An old school one is haint blue on the porch, or using things like spirit traps. Sometimes they look pretty, like this one made by my friend Missy Rising. And sometimes they look ugly, like these ones made by myself. This one uses just a piece of paper. This one is really more about the brick and where the brick came from, and what's under that ugly yogurt container. In folk magic, we work with what we have to. So in closing, do not forget that this world is made for the living. And when interacting with spirits, just remember that you are more powerful simply by being alive. Now, if you want to keep up with me, here's all my information. I have a podcast. I am going to be having a whole bunch of new, I'm getting the slides up for you here in just one moment. And oh, darn it. Am I going to be able to have the slides? Oh, shoot. Y'all, the slides might not work. I'm going to invite you to go ahead and take a screenshot of this. You can keep up with me if you want the slides. I'm happy to email them to you. But I'm going to have a ton of spirit communication coming up, communication opportunities starting in July, ranging from free to one-off classes to even like multi-week, like in-depth training. So thank you so much, everyone. And thank you so, so much to Llewellyn. I hope you all have the best day here.